Hello and welcome to the San Francisco Bay Area ISSA November 2022 chapter meeting and board member presentation from Brendan Eliason, who's going to talk to us about, teach us how to become unfishable. I'll give you a quick introduction, Brendan. Brendan has spent over 20 years in the food and beverage industry before returning to school to study computer science. Brendan has written education and training content for multiple books, as well as regular articles in a number of publications. Since transitioning into InfoSec, Brendan has worked to develop modern security awareness programs using actionable metrics and the same successful behavioral science-based techniques that he used in his previous education programs. Welcome, Brendan.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Such a great introduction, almost like I wrote it myself. Yeah, it is great to be here, and it's actually one of the topics that's kind of near and dear to my heart. It's one of the things that when I transitioned into computer science and security a number of years ago, I was honestly a little baffled by, because it's something that, having spent years doing, basically kind of using behavioral science for evil, i.e. marketing and sales, I was just used to certain things like metrics and a lot of specific techniques for communicating with people that I was kind of surprised not to see really used in a prevalent manner in security. And also, I was a little surprised to not see some things like feedback loops, where not all marketing campaigns are successful, but generally built into that is a loop of figuring out, okay, what worked, what didn't work, and then next iteration around, having a bigger, better, faster, stronger version of it. Whereas security still seems to be a lot of, well, this didn't work, let's just do it again. Well, that didn't work again. Well, like maybe the third time. And that for me has kind of been the impetus for really trying to think through how I can use a lot of my previous skills in a way that would really kind of hopefully ideally positively affect security awareness training. Luckily, I have found a very large pool of like-minded professionals in the security business who all were on the same page for. So it's very much a movement that I'm proud to be part of. For anyone, just as a side note, just a shout out to the Behavioral Cultural Council. It's a group that if anyone wants to join, let me know. But it's based in the Bay Area, but it's a national group, mostly on Slack and events. But we do a lot of, if any of this content resonates with you, this is a lot of what is shared in terms of actionable kind of programs and ideas and knowledge on that program. So I also want to start off with a disclaimer. Ultimately, phishing we'll absolutely touch, but phishing for me is also just kind of symbolic. It's kind of a proxy for a lot of other techniques and a lot of other issues that we have within security awareness. So phishing is definitely part of it. It's certainly one of the most prevalent things we have to deal with. But ultimately, the issue is bigger than phishing. And a lot of the things that are specific to solve phishing problems wouldn't necessarily technically apply to everything, but the broader ideas of how you're approaching the solution, I think are very much applicable to what we're looking at here. Now, the key here is that we have spent billions of dollars, yearly billions of dollars on and trying to fight phishing, but also just trying to instill security awareness in general. But really, our number one vulnerabilities have been the number one vulnerabilities for large periods of time. And it's interesting that in an industry like technology and like security, where some things are measured in milliseconds and fractions, you take a long lunch and you miss entire generations of technology, but a lot of that does not translate to other areas in the industry, such as security awareness, where things have not changed very much and ultimately are still changing, unfortunately, very slowly. So again, we're going to look at kind of using phishing as an example, but really looking in a broader sense of kind of what can we do as an industry to understand kind of how human beings actually think, how we act, how behavior has changed, and then also look at how other industries have very successfully implemented a lot of these things in the past. So first of all, we'll make this a shorter presentation. I've solved phishing. If every single person in the industry uses a complex passwords with a password manager, We use MFA with a hardware token, and we fully adopt FIDO2. I've just solved phishing, so that can be the talk right there. Unfortunately, that highlights the fact that all of these things are completely available. They're accessible to everyone in the industry. They really would solve 99.9% of all phishing attacks, but phishing attacks have not gone away. And that really highlights the broader problem, which is it's not a technical solution. It's not a
Are you
problem
gonna?
Yeah.
Because I agree on number 1 and 2. What is FIFO2?
Oh, that should be FIDO. That's a typo. I mean, and I was gonna, I'll get into FIDO a little more. I actually started to kind of go down a rabbit hole with FIDO with this talk and realized that that's probably a separate talk in itself. But FIDO2 is it's a organizational framework that was started to be developed about 10 years ago, specifically to do passwordless authentication. And it's an industry collective, including Apple and Microsoft and Google and really kind of everybody, that is recognized a decade ago that our current use of passwords is a huge flaw in the broader system, and is working to find a better way to do it. They have, in the last year or so, introduced their second tier of the FIDO2 standards. FIDO2 is a way of doing authentication, but using a lot of technology and procedures that really make a lot of the phishing specifically almost impossible to do. So it's a way to authenticate people, but it's also a way of really utilizing technology, really back-end technology, so you're not impacting front-end user use, to really fix a lot of the flaws that have been pervasive in kind of what currently our kind of big issues are with passwords. And we can talk about that a little bit more. I'll mention a little bit more going on, and I'm more than happy to kind of go into a little more detail on that towards the end of the talk. But they're all things, these are all standards, and it's all technology. And FIDO is based on actually 2 protocols that are all fully developed, fully issued, and Apple, Google, Microsoft fully support them in all current technologies. They are turnkey, ready to go. And again, they if by instituting these standards and using the technology they developed, you can basically eliminate the impacts of phishing, which is really what the broader point is, because who cares if you're phished if there's not actually any impact to that. But again, in addition to password managers and MFA have been around for much longer, and they too, especially with a hardware token MFA and not just SMS based, you really can solve most of the impact of phishing. All known technology, all things everyone has in their arsenal, and yet it hasn't gone away. And it hasn't gone away because we have 2 basic problems. Luckily, it's only 2. It's most of what we're doing and a lot of how we're going about doing that. Now, for starters, just kind of looking at what the industry is doing currently, this will be absolutely familiar to everyone here. We have set up in this industry a very adversarial relationship with our users, with our customers in a lot of cases, with just human beings in general, and that it's very much a blame game. And every time there's a breach, it's always the weakest link, and human beings are always the weakest link. The really fascinating and awful thing is that there's never really a point where we are kind of looking back at ourselves, realizing we're the security people. These are our security systems that have failed. The users did not set up any of this. They're implementing what we told them to implement. And if they're implementing it wrong, a lot of times it's because we have told them to do it wrong, or we have not given them the proper tools to do it. And it's convenient to blame people, but it's really not it doesn't get us anywhere. And the proof of that is that this hasn't gone away. This has been the blame game for decades now, and the problem is worse than it ever has been before. Just as a specific example, all the previous quotes came specifically from articles talking about the Uber hack from a couple months ago. And just as a quick outline here, these are kind of the highlights of all the security issues that Uber had, including knowing about these own vulnerabilities 7 months before they were exploited. The fact that once one of the individuals was socially engineered and they were able to get us to a VPN, but the VPN gave the attacker access to their entire system without further authentication, that within the system they had repositories that had admin passwords in plain text. There's more details right there. But this was a chain of failure that happened to include at one step social engineering and one person that got successfully phished. But the headlines, as you saw from the previous page, were not about the systemic failure. They're about, oh, the weakest link. It's like, oh, this one person, you know, that's their fault. The entire system collapsed. And A, that's unfair. B, it doesn't actually get us to a point where we can analyze why there was actually the systemic failure and what we can do about it to make it like sure that it doesn't happen again. It also like is I think one of the secondary parts of creating an adversarial relationship is it makes people not like us because we're ultimately being unfair. And by creating these schisms socially and within the culture of a company against security, where like they see us as people that are just blaming, you know, pointing the finger and saying, "No, it's your fault, it's your fault, it's your fault." These are things that kind of make it much harder to develop a positive security culture. And there's an enormous amount of research, which I won't go into here, but maybe another talk, about how really psychological safety and security culture, like those are things that really move a needle forward in terms of having an environment where people like actually make less mistakes and act in a much more consistent, much safer manner. And everything we do as a security to undermine that really undermines our broader cause of trying to be safer. But a lot of this comes from, again, this is 20 years old. This is, for many of you who probably read it, Bruce Schneider's book, Secrets and Lies. This is the quote that launched 1,000 awful memes in our industry for the last 20 years. The interesting thing is, I mean, having reread the book recently, and actually had the chance to meet Bruce a couple weeks ago because he was in Philly. You know, this is the quote everyone points to, but a couple pages, this is the quote that no one remembers, and that the weakest link isn't in context. You know, it has a very specific context for him in the book, and that really the bigger problem or the bigger focus should be defense in depth, which is not a shock to any of us. The problem is everyone latched on to the first quote about human being the weakest link, and we kind of gloss over or just conveniently forget about the second part of really the important part is defense in depth. It's not a matter of, you know, if one human can be socially engineered one time and it can take down your entire system, it's not their fault. It's your fault. It's our fault for creating a system that is so precarious that can cascade and take everything else out by itself. So really the broader goal should be looking systemically to see what are our vulnerabilities, specifically what do we need to do to combat those, and then kind of looking at what we can do with our employees and our customers to kind of instill behaviors that will ultimately get our broader goals. As an example of that, I'm just I've been doing a lot of driving today. My car's parked out in the parking lot. And I can safely offer anyone in this call, anyone in my neighborhood, $1 million if they want to walk out to the parking lot and lift my car over their head. That's a lot of incentive. Who wouldn't want $1 million? And so that's motivation. At the same time, you can't do it. Motivation by itself will not equal the results you want because human beings just don't do things really well. There's some things the human brain does well, and we're really great abstract thinkers. But ultimately, we suck at math. And as part of math is very much passwords, encryption, and a lot of the protocols that we rely on. And so by relying on human beings to do a lot of this work, a lot of we're talking like password cracking, who's going to do better at that, a computer or a human being? The problem is we've based this entire system on human beings coming up with these really complicated, like hundreds of complicated long passwords and putting them in system with this complicated encryption that all has to be implemented in very specific ways. We suck at that. We weren't good at it 100 years ago. We weren't good at it 1,000 years ago. We're not going to be good at it 5,000 years from now. We are biologically limited in terms of how we interact with that, especially when compared to a computer. And so part of the bigger systemic problem is instead of trying to fix the system where we're overly reliant on things like complex passwords, and removing that as a potential threat, we just keep on blaming people because they do it badly. And they do it badly. They're always going to do it badly. That the same as lifting a car over your head. So we are not the first industry to face this. Ultimately, you can probably go way as far as there has been sales and people. There have been, behavioral science and people trying to use behavioral science to kind of gain things or motivate people. But a lot of the modern movement, started within all of our lifetimes, probably in the 1960s, 1970s. Just a brief introduction. A lot of this started with economics, where that's where the money is. And they found in the up through the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of really very large, very complex economic models that ultimately didn't work. They were not predictive. They thought people would do certain things, usually things that were very logical and very that said very clearly people are going to act in their own self-interest, that they're going to maximize their own self-benefit, and that should be predictable and that's always going to happen, and it just didn't happen. It's not true, because human beings are fundamentally not purely logical animals. There are two Jewish researchers, called Kahneman and Tversky, who have since won a Nobel Prize. At least Kahneman did, and Tversky unfortunately passed away before he was able to receive it, but it was for both of their work. And they were really the first people to kind of take a look at human action and realize that, yeah, our motivations are not linear. One of the things they looked at, which this chart kind of highlights, is what they call is a lot of their groundbreaking work on loss aversion, which in a general sense says if you have an item, the amount you value that item is different than the value you feel when somebody else has that same item. And if you have that item taken away from you, which is kind of the loss aversion part of it, you will feel, they do a lot of studies with coffee mugs. And they would give coffee mugs to half of a group of people and then watch them kind of negotiate for coffee mugs. And they found is that, if you felt that, or if you felt like someone else's coffee mug was worth $5, that was a fair assessment. But if you had the coffee mug, you actually felt like a $10 loss to have that coffee mug taken away from you. This is not logical. In a logical environment, everyone should think that the coffee mug is worth the same amount of money. This was the foundation for a lot of other work that Kahneman and Tversky did that really highlighted kind of the blind spots that human beings have and how we think and how we act. And recognizing that, again, expecting people to behave in a certain way where they're biologically not going to do, and repeating that is insanity. So what they did was lay the foundation for a system where you could recognize how people actually act. Not just how you want them to act, not just how you theorize they're going to act, but how they actually act, and then use that as a basis for coming up with systems to kind of change and or just understand their behavior. In a general sense, they came up with this theory, or this theory was created on bounded rationality, which said that, it's not that people are completely illogical, it's the fact that there's a lot of other things at play. And in a very limited sense, this is kind of the system that has been set up to realize that, one of the big flaws is that we don't always have all the knowledge we want right in front of us. And this is particularly pertinent in security, because we're all security professionals. And when we sit down to a computer and look at a network or receive emails, we have years, decades of very specific industry security knowledge that we're using to assess all these things for threat dangers, for how they fit in attack frameworks. Most people don't have that. They don't need that. They're accountants. They have their jobs to do. We have our jobs to do, but they have limited knowledge, and that limits, constrains kind of what their actions can be. Also, I think especially pertinent is time limits as well, where with phishing attacks, a lot of the problem is, these are all things, one of the primary attack vectors of phishing attacks is urgency. It's like, we need this right now. I'm the CEO of the company, and I need you to send me $5,000 in iTunes cards, right now. And so this is done deliberately because it decreases your time limits and changes the degree to which you can make rational decisions. And again, understanding this, you can actually start understanding more why current systems for dealing with this just don't work, because we're not dealing with, we keep on taking actions expecting people are going to change the way they act and how they're able to act, instead of understanding how they really do act and then building a system around that. So this highlights a bigger question. Great, so people aren't logical. So we have clear historical evidence for the fact that we're not always linear, logical, perfect, Vulcan actors. So what can we do? And what is available to us to help people make better decisions, make better security decisions specifically? Another very popular, I think also very good, another spelling error, I apologize, model, BJ Fogg from Stanford is one of the leaders in trying to understand fundamentally how people make decisions, and ultimately how you can motivate behavior change in people. And this is very specifically applies to a lot of security awareness. So we have a long list of things that we want people to do, and a lot of them fail. And this ultimately points out in a very simple way why they fail. One of the problems with Fogg, which is not his fault, is the fact that despite it being relatively simple, I mean, the chart shows generally that, basically you can control motivation to some degree. You can make people want to do it. You control ability, which is more or less if something is easy to do or hard to do. And then there's a prompt. So there's really only 3 factors. The problem is, on a very simple reading of Fogg, the 3 factors look more or less equal, and they're really not. And if you read Fogg, Fogg is also very, very clear about the fact that they're not. And everyone wants to focus on motivation, which is really a lot of the foundation for a lot of security awareness training right now, which is, yeah, it's hard to do, but we'll scare people, or we'll incentivize people, or we'll just expect people to do better. But we're really going to focus on the motivation part without actually focusing on and dealing with the more structural issues of ability, of how easy is that to do, how does that action fit into what they do on a normal day-to-day basis, and what can we do on our side to make things easier, not just increase motivation. More specifically, there's a great quote from Fogg that kind of, I think, elucidates this, that really breaks down that in the simplest way, there's only 2 ways for you to change behavior, and motivation is not it. Motivation will never be it. People are very, very hard to motivate, partly because we have lots of different competitions for our motivation. And people like to say, when they're talking derisively of employees for security, that, oh, they don't care. Like, they don't care about security. They care, but they also care a lot about other things. And we have competition for that caring. And if that's the only thing you're using for your motivation, you're going to lose. And we have lost, and we'll continue to lose unless we really understand that and find a better way to do that. And he points out really 2 specific ways where you can consistently motivate change and change behavior. And again, it's incremental steps and redesigning your environment. The second part especially goes back to ability. If the task you're asking people to do is difficult, and if it's something that they have to employ different tools than normally use, that they have to, people are hired to do a job. If you're asking them to stop doing their job to do your job of security, and then go back to doing their job again, that's a lot of friction to ask for normal people. And really, if we want to be successful, we really need to focus more on the redesigning the environment part of this equation, and figuring out ways that we can either eliminate roadblocks, narrow roadblocks, decrease friction in general for people that otherwise are inclined to do security. I know very few people want to deliberately not be secure, but we need to make these actions as simple for them as possible. And that really is what our job is. Another book, more pop book that maybe a lot of you might have read is A Nudge by Richard Thaler, also Nobel-winning economist. And that kind of gives you some idea of how fundamental and how important a lot of this research is, that we have 2 Nobel Prizes very much overlapped on the same topic in the theory of economics, because this knowledge has very much transformed in the last generation how people actually look at economics and how people understand how human beings really act in complex marketplaces. And it's been very successful in really motivating people, or taking advantage of people, taking advantage of behavior to kind of get what other organizations or people will want from them. And again, at the end of the day, you've got to make it easy. That really is the fundamental thing. Motivation is not going to work. Motivation has never worked as the primary mover for any of this. You have to find a way to structurally make it easy. And this also relates back to the very beginning of looking at, it's not technical solutions. We have technical solutions, but it's got to be technical solutions that are seamlessly applied in people's day-to-day behavior and actions, that aren't just them, like for phishing training, expecting a normal person who gets 100 emails a day to systematically go through and check 8 points of data on every email in order to ascertain whether this is a high threat level or low threat level for a phishing email. That's never going to work. And that is high friction. That is a high barrier, and ultimately that we logically end up with the outcome that we currently have, which is most people kind of ignore it. At best, every now and then, they'll click on a phishing button every now and then. But really, like, we have not done enough on our side to put in systems that really eliminate the threat from this, that are easy for people to use. This is Thaler has come up with kind of a 7-stage kind of loop for how you actually systematically build in behavior change for people, and what he calls kind of nudges for behavior change. A lot of these, as we could go through very quickly, are things that we could very much learn from, or should take into account when we're building security awareness programs. The first couple that I think are important is really defining what behavior you're going to change, because that really is the two major parts. You need to find what people you want people to do, and then you need to define how people are going to actually do that. But if you just have one of those, you're going to fail. And if you have a bad goal that is not based in like a solid foundation of either where you need to get for behavior change, or one that just isn't realistic for human beings to accomplish, then it doesn't matter how you could make it very easy, but if the goal is bad, you're not going to get anywhere. So really defining your changes very clearly, understanding how the things you're asking fit in with the workflow, and considering your employees, how does this look to them? How does this affect, do they have to stop what they're doing in order to try and do the thing you want them to do, or can that be seamlessly integrated in what they're doing? You need to then present the option in a way that where they understand what you want, where they have the tools to actually accomplish what you want. And then you need to openly listen to feedback, because none of this is none of this is linear. As I mentioned at the beginning, in marketing, there's always a feedback loop. You're looking at what's sticking, what's not sticking, and it's not always going to work. But the worst thing is not failure. The worst thing is not knowing what succeeds and what didn't succeed, because then you either keep on doing things that fail, or you don't focus enough resources on the things that are succeeding. But it's the iteration loop that is really the most important. And then I think this loops around to maintaining momentum with short-term wins. And this goes back to BJ Fogg's idea of small steps and of small incremental steps, because it's something you need to reinforce. This is not a, every year, every quarter, we sit down and we watch, a video for an hour, and we click on a little button, and then we do a quick quiz, and then we don't talk about security again, and it's not integrated into anything else you do. This is very much the opposite of that. This is, having these things integrated in very, very small but consistent ways all the way through like a time period, all the way through the month, through the quarter, through the year, and not just one and done compliance-based security awareness training, which unfortunately is what a lot of the industry relies on. As another aspect of this is relevance, because a lot of what we do in focusing on large amounts of training in very seldomly throughout the year, is we're giving people a lot of information that is not relevant to them at that moment at all. The more successful programs, and certainly the more successful work I've seen, very much focuses on relevance. And the reason there's a life preserver there is that, if you're swimming and you're drowning, that is a very relevant piece of safety hardware for you. And that is something you want right now, you need right now, and is amazingly applicable to the thing you're doing right now. If you're sitting and grabbing coffee at Starbucks and somebody throws you a life preserver, that is not only useless, it's actually annoying, and it's actually getting in your way of doing something. So understanding the context in which we're presenting information to people, and understanding like what they actually need at that moment, is really a fundamental part of redesigning the way we think of systems where we can get people to change their behavior. And that's one of the advantages of using a very slow, moderate kind of drip system for education, is that, if you receive an email, at that moment, you don't need to, you don't necessarily need information on a lot of other compliance laws. You don't need, you don't need data on, USB safety, but at that exact moment, you might need a little nudging for like to make it easy to recognize, read an email address, or to look at, whether there's if you receive this from a known user or other things, but in context. And the context will be very important to what you want to accomplish, because 5 minutes before, 5 minutes after, that information isn't necessarily valuable to the person you're trying to give it to. So this again goes back to, once we have now that we've kind of framed what it is we're going for, we're framed philosophically kind of what types of actions we were trying to instill, what are some other ways we can use behavioral science to understand how people learn, and ultimately what we can do about that to kind of get our goals. One of my favorite things that favorite charts is the forgetting curve. That really highlights a lot of the problem with, again, current security awareness, like quarterly compliance-based security awareness training, which is without a drip system, without consistent, even just small, consistent reinforcement of action, people forget. Again, this is set in hours and days, and that you will forget, more than 60% of what you've just been presented within an hour of receiving it, if there's no additional context or feedback or repetition for it. And then with more repetition, as you kind of continue to have small bits fed back to you in context and with higher relevance, you can get that forgetting curve, shrink that down to the point where you can get people to retain 80, 90% of what you're trying to teach them. But that's never going to be in a single sitting, just giving them one huge block of information all at once. And it very much is a long-term, systemic, slow drip process. Another thing that I don't see a whole lot of, unfortunately, is an understanding of just learning models. That people are wired very differently, which I think is pretty obvious. But in terms of learning styles, there's a huge difference in retention rates. And this is something where we can draw on just teacher education or teaching philosophy, and understanding how it is people actually retain, understand, and contextualize information. And it's not the same for everybody. And I think if you're running a very successful security awareness program, it shouldn't be just one of these categories. It shouldn't just be all written material. It shouldn't be all visual material. It shouldn't be auditory. It should be a mix of these, and understanding that most people encompass more than one of these categories. And so by having this is another way you can do repetition, and you can increase your context, is by having the same content presented, consciously aware of the different ways in which people are going to be taking in that information, and how you can make sure it's more relevant to them and kind of sticks a little bit more. Now, I start from the top saying that this is not brand new anything, and I'm not inventing anything. I just do a lot of reading. We've talked about behavioral economics as being one of the areas where there have been some really fundamental changes in our lifetime, using a lot of these techniques, but it's not the only one, and there's many others. One of the ones that is pointed to a lot is the aviation industry. And this was a relatively long quote, but I really like what Simone says. I think it's Simon, actually. I think it's English. But this really highlights the airline industry is actually one of the industries that actually really almost predating behavioral economics had developed an internal culture of safety that has caused them to be one of the most consistently safe, and also kind of continually improving industries anywhere in the world. And it's an industry where obviously we put our lives in their hands on a day-to-day basis. But they have found a way, going back to the 50s and 60s, to really take a lot of what we do already, what we do in a microcosm, kind of for blameless postmortems after security breaches, But so we unfortunately don't really share like that philosophy to, I think, the broader security industry. And we're here, this is very much fundamental to how the airline industry runs as like all of avionics. And a lot of the important part is that they run all of this as blameless, and all of this is looked at as a system. And if there is a mistake, if a crash happened, it's not pilot error. They recognize that if for the pilot to fail, there had to be a cascade of failures that led up to that. And they look at what that cascade was, and then systematically go through each of those steps and try and figure out what can we do systemically to make sure that doesn't happen again. As a small example, I know in the 60s, there was like some very popular models of planes that their initial design, they had two levers sitting to the right of the pilot, and one controlled the flaps and one controlled the landing gear. And they were sitting right next to each other. And there were a couple accidents because, in like intense situations, a pilot reaches down to pull the flaps and instead pulls the landing gear. And what they could have done, and what we probably would have done, is pilot error. They blame the user. He was the weakest link. Instead, they looked at, oh, that's probably a dumb idea. We shouldn't have two very similar handles right next to each other. So we need to like either redesign the handles or completely take a handle out and put it somewhere else. But we need to provide a structural change. We're not relying on the behavior change of the pilot to always be perfect in the situation. We need to remove the ability for that to be a problem ever again. I think philosophically, that's something we really need to be looking at a lot more as an industry, is in looking at these systemic kind of structural part of what we can do to prevent a lot of these security attacks. And you want to look at the results of this. And clearly see on the left is airline fatalities, and on the right is cyber attacks. I apologize to my former stats professor. I was trying to find some that lined up year to year to be a little more one-to-one. There's a lot more data for the airline industry, so that one goes back, to the 1970s, where really we only have good cyber attack data for the last like 10, 20 years. But you can clearly see a difference. By using a system where, they are actually looking at structural safety fixes and not relying on simply educating the pilot, like, you shouldn't pull that lever. Like, by avoiding that, they've actually majorly dropped, a clear line in terms of fatalities per million flights and overall fatalities, while also increasing the number of flights. And that's the charts we should want. Whereas we're at, a chart that is going the wrong direction. And I think part of the reason for that is that, again, we have not employed really any solutions now that we weren't employing when these charts started. And we keep on doing the same thing, but expecting different outcomes, but instead our problems are actually getting worse. One thing I find particularly interesting, the chart on the bottom right, that actually compares malware versus phishing. Like, about 2017, 2018, you see where the phishing starts to spike and malware starts to drop. That for me is actually a very array of hope for some things we are doing well in the industry, because you can actually see there a lot of that dip in malware wasn't simply us educating people about malware more. It wasn't just giving people malware tests. It was us as an industry finding structural like security solutions to a lot of malware. And so, like, I would say, like, sandboxing in a lot of modern browsers, like sandboxing in Chrome, the phishing is still a problem, but the payloads for phishing has changed a lot. Going back a couple of years, like drive-by downloads and executables straight out of the email were a much more bigger problem, and they're not anymore. And they happen, but as you can clearly see, we came up with a way that most users will never even see in the background to eliminate the ability for executables to be like really as much of a danger as they were before with an email, but we haven't figured out how to do that with phishing yet. Because phishing ultimately is still relying on, now we got to use credential theft. And because the way we use credentials in our industry is so fundamentally flawed, we haven't really found a way. I guess we have found a way, we've not instituted a way to have that equal effect that we've had on malware. Another example, this is a company I worked for briefly a year or so ago. They're effing HR. And this is how far behind we are, is that HR is ahead of us in technology, which it should never be. And this is a company out of Australia. It's the former head of HR for Eliason and the former head of HR for Culture Amp, two very large companies. And ultimately, they left their respective companies because they knew they could do something better. And the interesting part that I think we could really look at from what they do that applies to us is personalization. And this goes back to relevance, because for them, one of the hallmarks of their system is the fact that they're using a lot of like metadata in their systems. They're using they're kind of scraping a lot of data out of Jira, out of Slack, out of Bamboo, and using that data to understand what each individual employee kind of is going through or is doing at that moment. And if you're an employee who is then promoted to manager, the system recognizes, oh, you got a promotion to manager. Now that you're a manager, you need to know these certain things as a manager that you did not need to know before. So instead of giving you, when you're hired, giving you a 1,000-page dossier on here's every HR memo and circular that we have, and you read them all now, and then you aren't going to look at them again for another 5 years. Like, we're going to have to break all of those up into smaller pieces. We're going to recognize when those pieces are relevant to you at that moment. And then we're going to deliver those pieces to you so that you can say immediately, like, oh, well, yeah, I actually need that. I want to use that. That's relevant to me. And that is what it will affect actual change. I think there's a lot of room for that. And I see there's a couple companies I know of that are using this kind of this basic philosophy as well, of using a lot of the background metadata for like how people are interacting with their with computers, and knowing kind of what they're writing, where they're going, what they're doing, and using those as very, very small, very, very specific triggers to prompt them to basically take positive action. But it's very small, very relevant, very targeted, and really delivered kind of just in time when they actually are looking for that information. So to kind of sum up very quickly, there are ways, there are existing ways that we can, I think, better understand what the true foundation of a lot of our security issues are. And there's tools available to us right now to combat those that have been used in other industries. We just need to break out. I think really we need to want to do it. We need to recognize that compliance by itself is not the best place to come from in looking at security awareness. And we need to be open to really kind of fundamentally changing a lot of our expectations for what people can do or should do, and take a lot more personal responsibility as security people for the security programs we institute, and recognize that those failures are our fault and that we should do something about them. Questions?